Hello, 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 and welcome once again to Corpus Cast, the podcast from Aston University about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society. I'm your host, Dr. Robbie Love, and today our topic is corpus stylistics, a topic I'm very excited to return to after first discussing literary linguistics with Michaela Malberg back in 2022, one of our earlier episodes. Put simply, corpus stylistics is, in the words of my guest today, the combination of corpus linguistic techniques with stylistic analysis. And although stylistics is strongly associated with the linguistic analysis of literary texts, stylistics, and now increasingly corpus stylistics, does include the study of non-literary texts as well. And so to discuss corpus stylistics today is my guest, Dan McIntyre, Professor of English Language in the Department of English at Uppsala University. Dan has research interests in stylistics, corpus linguistics, and the history of the English language. He's co-editor of the Bloomsbury book series, Advances in Stylistics, and co-founder and co-editor of Babel, the magazine for lovers of languages and linguistics. His recent books include the Babel Lexicon of Language, History of English, a resource book for students, Corpus Stylistics, Theory and Practice, and Applying Linguistics, Language and the Impact Agenda. And so without any further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome to Corpus Cast, Professor Dan McIntyre. Hello, Dan. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Robbie. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for coming on. It's great to have the chance to chat with you. And as always, I'm going to start with the question I ask all my guests to kick us off. And that is, what does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Yeah, well, I'm one of these people who sees corpus linguistics as a methodology. So it's a methodology, a set of methods for studying large quantities of language data. And it's a methodology that can be applied in many different areas of linguistics, and in many different disciplines. And as somebody who's interested in style in language, the real value of that for me is that it allows you to see patterns in large quantities of language that you perhaps wouldn't be able to see otherwise. And that's what makes it so valuable as a methodology in stylistics. So I guess that I'm a methodologist in corpus terms.
And we'll get into that in terms of how corpus linguistics can help us with investigating style in language. But first of all, a bit more generally, when, why, how, where did you first become interested in the study of language?
I was thinking about this, and I had interests in language, I think, from quite an early age. I remember on the first day that I went to junior school, the teacher came in the classroom and she wrote the same word 3 times on the blackboard. The first time she wrote it in italics, sort of with the letters slanted forwards. The second time she wrote it normally. And the third time she wrote it with the letters slanted backwards. And she said to the class, which one of these is wrong? One of them is wrong, which one is it? And we were looking for spelling mistakes and that kind of thing. And we couldn't spot what it was. And eventually she said, it's the last one. You should never, ever write a word with the letters slanted backwards. She said, it's wrong. Don't do it. And even at the time, I remember thinking, this is really odd. You know, why would it? I can't see why that's wrong. And I had another teacher, and in all other respects, he was a fantastic teacher. But he wouldn't let us use the word get. You always had to use a synonym instead, fetch or obtain or something like that. And again, I thought, this is really weird. You know, get is a word, perfectly good word. Why can't I use it? So I had all these sort of questions sort of bubbling away, but I didn't really know that they were linguistic questions, and I had no way of articulating that. And then I guess it was interesting that I don't think I got much education in English language at school. And I think that's probably common to a lot of people of my generation in the UK. And so when I was choosing A-levels at the age of 16, I was advised to go for literature rather than language, simply because language wasn't taken seriously as an A-level. So I did English literature at A-level, and I enjoyed it, and I found I was quite good at it. But I didn't know why I was good at it, because I didn't really know what game we were supposed to be playing. It seemed to me that you could pretty much say whatever you want so long as you could articulate that well. So I could write a decent sentence. So I used to get reasonable marks for English literature essays. But I had loads of questions as a result of reading a lot of literature as part of my A level that I just couldn't find answers for. And then when I went to Lancaster University as an undergraduate, I don't know what it's like now, but at the time you had to do 3 subjects in your first year. I wanted to do English literature, and I ended up doing some English language courses too. And I did a course in stylistics. And it was a complete revelation to me, because suddenly I had answers to these questions that I'd wanted to know about. For example, why is it that poets break a sentence across a line boundary, and why do they do it at the particular point that they do it? And of course, it's to do with foregrounding. You're foregrounding particular elements at the end of the line, at the beginning of the line. Or, if you're reading a novel, why is it that sometimes you feel really sort of involved in that fictional world? And learning all about the linguistic techniques that give rise to particular points of view and that might invoke empathy in the reader. All of that was a complete revelation. And that's really what got me into linguistics, because it was suddenly giving me the answers to questions that I'd had when I was studying English literature. And of course, the linguistics course generally, that was giving me answers to those prescriptive questions about what you should and shouldn't do in language, and realizing that, that made no sense. That was also really important to me. So yeah, that's how I got into language.
And did you end up transferring to language after that for your degree, or did you stick with literature for, in that first program you did at Lancaster?
Yeah, no. After that, I was a fully paid up card-carrying linguist. But yeah, I switched to doing linguistics and English language, and that's what I did for my undergraduate degree. Yeah,
and
but
then
we did a focus on stylistics. I guess that was my real interest at the time.
Yes, and of course, at the time, stylistics was emerging, and there, at Lancaster there were, a few sort of fairly big names in the area, teaching you at the time, I'm assuming.
Yeah, Mick Short and Jeffrey Leach taught the undergraduate course at the time, along with Eleanor Semino and Jonathan Culpepper. And there were lots of people doing PhDs in stylistics. It was a really vibrant stylistics community at that point. It was a good place to be.
And did you stay on there for your PhD as well?
I did, yeah. I left after I graduated, and I went and taught English in Italy for a year. And then I went back and I did an MA. And then I did a PhD, and Mick Short supervised that. That was a PhD in cognitive stylistics. So I didn't get to the corpus stuff until a bit later on.
So when did the corpus stuff happen? Was that later in your academic career?
It was while I was doing my PhD, actually. I'd done a course in corpus linguistics at MA level. I think I might have done one at undergraduate level as well. And while I was doing my PhD, I got a job as a research assistant on a project that was funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Board, as it was. And that was a project that Mick Short and Eleanor Semino and Tony McHenry had got some funding for. And it was a project to investigate speech writing and thought presentation in spoken English. Mick and Eleanor had done a project looking at that phenomenon in written language. And in this project, we were looking at how it worked in speech. And I just got given that job. This was back in the day when you could just be given a job, no application, no interview or anything like that. It seems staggering, really. So I got this 2-year research assistant post. And because I was sort of involved in the more technical side of the project. I mean, it wasn't hugely technical, but I was involved in the corpus compilation and the tagging and checking the validity of the tags and that sort of thing. I ended up working closely with Tony McHenry. So I learned a lot from Tony on that project, not just about corpus linguistics, but about things like project management, how you keep a record of decisions you've made while annotating a text, that kind of thing. So that's how I got into it.
And so at the time, I suppose, was that a moment of realization that, you know, corpus linguistics has a contribution to make to style and literary analysis, not just literary text, of course, but you know, the sorts of stuff that you'd be looking at earlier in your, you know, your undergraduate degree as well?
Yeah, I guess I started to think in those terms at that point. What we were doing was tagging speech for categories of speech writing and thought presentation. And I could see the value in doing that to try and discern some kind of quantitative norm for the different categories. You know, is it the case that direct speech really is the most frequent category of speech presentation, that kind of thing. So that was really interesting. I still couldn't quite see how you could apply the corpus method in other areas of stylistics. That took a little bit longer for me to figure out. But I think, you know, it was the case that not many people were doing corpus stylistics back then. So everybody was trying to sort of figure it out as they went, really. I think Jeffrey Leach was starting to do some interesting stuff with corpora, looking at elements of style at that point. And there were people like Martin Wynne at Oxford who'd worked on Mick and Eleanor's previous project. So people like that were around doing interesting early exploratory stuff, really. But yeah, that's where I got into it.
And fast forward some time, you're now Professor of English Language. Give us a kind of rough sketch of, you know, your academic career after you got your PhD at Lancaster, and kind of how you kind of progressed into the position you have now.
Yeah, well, I was really lucky, and I managed to get a job before I finished my PhD. I got a lectureship at Liverpool Hope University College, as it was. And it was a bit of a shock going there after being at Lancaster, because Lancaster obviously is a huge department. And in Liverpool Hope, I was in a tiny department. There were 3 of us, and none of us had our PhDs at that point. So that was a real shock to the system. And I stayed at Liverpool Hope for about a year. And then I moved to the University of Huddersfield, and that was an English department at that point. But there were slightly more linguists than literature people, which was unusual for an English department. And there were lots of people with similar interests there, which was great. So there was a sort of core of us who were interested in stylistics. And when I got my job there, I got asked to develop a couple of modules. So I developed one in stylistics and one in corpus linguistics, partly because I wanted to learn more about that myself, having had this experience as an RA at Lancaster. And when I moved to Huddersfield, at that point, Michaela Malberg got my old job at Liverpool Hope. So she was sort of almost on the doorstep, which was great. And she was doing mainly corpus linguistics at that point. I don't think she'd quite moved into stylistics to the degree that she has since. And so Michaela and I used to meet up occasionally in Liverpool, and I would ask her stuff about corpus linguistics. So, you know, I learned an awful lot from talking to her. And, you know, we talked about stylistics together and that kind of thing. So yeah, gradually I started doing more and more corpus linguistics at Huddersfield, and ended up teaching in that area rather more than in stylistics, actually. And over time, we managed to set up a linguistics department. So we separated out from English literature. They joined up with creative writing. So we went in slightly different directions. And that was all great for quite some time until things happened, which I guess we'll talk about a bit later on, to do with what's going on in the UK generally, and then how linguistics has been affected by that. And I sort of had an inkling that, you know, things were not going in the right direction, really. And so started to think maybe I should think about moving. And for various reasons, ended up at Uppsala University in Sweden, which is a very nice place to be. I wanted to be somewhere a bit bigger, really, with a few more colleagues to talk to and a few more things going on. And so I'm in a faculty of languages at the moment, which is a nice place to be. There's a Department of English, which I'm in, and a Department of Linguistics and Philology, Nordic languages, modern languages. So it feels quite a luxury to be in a faculty that is sort of almost entirely focused on linguistics. So that's the potted history. That's how I ended up here.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about corpus stylistics then. And I suppose we should get some basic definition out of the way before we talk about the corpus bit. Let's talk about the style bit. What sort of in layman's terms, what do we mean when we're talking about style as it pertains to language? What is style? Because there's a lot of other terms that maybe overlapping a bit or related, genre, register, things like that, idiolect, things like that. What do we mean when we're talking about style?
Yeah. So you can only have style if you've got choice, basically. So wherever you have a choice of linguistic options, then style emerges from that. So you can say, for example, I'm really tired. Or you could say, I'm absolutely knackered. And you've said the same thing in propositional content terms, but you've done it slightly differently stylistically, and that has some sort of impact on how what you've said is received and perceived by the person that you're talking to. So yeah, style is about choice, and I guess when most people think about stylistics, they might think about authorial style and what distinguishes one writer from another, and of course that's one kind of style, and it's something that you can study from a stylistic perspective if you use stylometrics, for example, computational techniques to examine linguistic differences between authors. But then there's also things like genre style, what sets a newspaper apart from a poem or a recipe, that kind of thing. So that's not necessarily anything to do with the author. That's to do with the confines of the genre that you're working in. But interestingly, I think the element of style that most stylisticians are interested in is text style. So what are the linguistic choices in a particular text that give rise to particular effects? So if you're reading a poem and it makes you feel incredibly emotional, or happy or sad or whatever it might be, can we see anything in the linguistic makeup of that text that would cause that kind of reaction? And of course, you can't just talk about linguistic elements if you're trying to explain those kinds of things, but language must be a part of that. So yeah, text style, I guess, is about how the choices that authors make in specific text give rise to the effects that readers experience when they read those texts. And that's what I guess what I was initially interested in, and that's, as I say, what I think a lot of stylisticians are still interested in. But it still goes back to this core idea that style is all about choice. You can't have style unless you've got a choice from a series of options.
Let's stick with literary text for now, I suppose, because it's the most kind of canonical, association with the history of stylistics. What you said there is interesting. It seems that language, obviously, when we're talking about any type of text, but certainly literary text, it seems to be crucial. I'm going to put you on the spot here, I suppose. It seems from what you said earlier that you were studying literature and it was kind of, you understood what you were doing and you could, successfully kind of write about texts, but it was perhaps a little bit kind of based on instinct and not really knowing, you can recognize things, but you don't necessarily know why is the text having an effect on me. And you were convinced by the contribution that linguistics can make. I guess my question is, do you think it's possible to study literature without studying the language of literature?
I guess that I would say language really ought to be a consideration in whatever kind of analysis that you're doing of a literary text, simply because that's what literature is made of. And it seems to me odd that you would disregard that fact when you're studying a piece of literature. That said, I don't think it necessarily has to always be the prime focus, because there are lots of other interesting and important things that you need to take account of if you're studying a literary text anyway. The context in which it was written, the author themselves, perhaps the background that they came from, what might have led them to produce the piece of work that they did. So all of that is important. But I think language is at least equally important. And so I would find it very difficult to do any sort of literary analysis without any consideration of the language.
Zooming in on corpus stylistics specifically now, then, what would you say? Corpus linguistics, of course, has grown so much, and almost every week there seems to be a new tool or a new approach or some new statistic or the new best way to do things, and that's wonderful. Obviously, it shows the kind of growth and development in the rigor and the choice that researchers have in how they do things. But sort of trying to kind of find the needle in the haystack, so to speak, what would you say is kind of overall the most useful, or the set of most useful corpus methods that are typically kind of used in stylistics that really help with this sort of analysis?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think the absolutely key method that's been really, really useful for stylistics is keyness, because it ties in so neatly with what is a fundamental concept in stylistics, and that is the concept of foregrounding theory. And foregrounding basically says that the elements of a text that will grab a reader's attention and that will stay with them, and that they'll work harder to understand, are those elements of a text that somehow stand out as being unusual and don't meet your expectations of the text. And of course, keyness analysis is a way of getting at precisely that. So you can look at what's statistically unusual in your text, whether that be a key word, a key part of speech, a key semantic domain, whatever it might be. So not only that, but it also gives you a sense of what the background is in the text against which those foregrounded elements are standing out. And I think prior to the advent of corpus linguistics, the only way that you could sort of look at the concept of foregrounding was from a semantic point of view. So how is a particular element of language breaking my semantic expectations of language? And Mukarovsky writes about the standard language being the background against which foregrounded elements are perceived. But the problem for stylistics was always, how do we identify that standard language? What is it? My sense of a standard might be different from yours. But if we're doing that kind of analysis within a corpus, then we've agreed on what the object of study is. And if our corpus is a good representation of a particular population of language data, then again, we can be reasonably confident about that background. And of course, statistical foregrounding is just one aspect of foregrounding, but it is a really important one, and it's one that you couldn't really get at before corpus linguistics. So that, I think, has been an absolutely key method for stylistics, just that the whole concept of keyness. So yeah, that's really important, I think.
I want to go back to reported speech and thought, actually, because I don't identify, cards on the table, I don't identify as a stylistician, although my colleagues in the Aston Stylistics Research Group are doing their best to change that. But I did a couple of years ago, I was tasked with teaching a module on crime fiction here at Aston. And I agreed to do it on the condition that I could turn it into a corpus stylistics module about the study of crime text, so that I wasn't sort of, almost fraudulently just teaching a literature module without having studied it. And that was agreed upon. So I started, learning more about specifically how corpus methods are applied in stylistics, and I used the click tool that Michaela and colleagues developed. And one of the things that as soon as I noticed it, I thought, of course, that's so, but it hadn't really occurred to me. Part of the stylistic choices that an author can make is in the reporting verbs that they use for, did somebody say something or shout something or scream something or yell something, and the patterns that you can tease apart between different characters as they're being described as saying or speaking or thinking things, and the associations where some characters tend to, sort of consistently kind of have more neutral terms associated with how they speak, and others less neutral and more evaluative. And it sort of was like a light switch going off on my head. I hadn't studied stylistics at university myself, so I was very unfamiliar with this stuff. And I thought, of course, yeah, that is a really good, way of seeing the techniques of authors. I know I'm monologuing a lot. I do have a question related to this, which is, and maybe something that students ask as well, I'm not sure, but to what extent do you think authors are consciously aware of those sorts of choices that you only notice when you kind of take a quantitative perspective across, say, an entire novel or even series of novels, where you see repeating patterns of, so correlations between certain word choices, stylistic choices, and certain characters? To what extent do you think that authors are sitting there really kind of consciously aware of those, or do you think we're uncovering techniques and strategies that may not be kind of an explicit choice?
Yeah, that's a question that gets asked a lot, and particularly by students, and it's a good one to ask. And I think the answer is that probably most of the time, these are entirely unconscious decisions on authors. And if you talk to some authors, they get quite irritated at the idea that they need to even think about those things in conscious terms. So yeah, I guess that most of the time it's unconscious. These are norms and techniques that you absorb from reading. And if you're a good reader, that's the only way that you're going to become a good writer. So all of those things go into your toolbox of techniques, I guess, and you use them entirely unconsciously. But that's not really the issue for stylistics, because what's important is that those choices, whether conscious or unconscious, they have an impact on readers. They have an effect. So it's trying to identify what the linguistic source of that effect might be. But of course, it is very important to say that it's not the case that one particular linguistic technique always leads to one particular linguistic effect, and that sort of form and function relation is entirely consistent. That's certainly not the case. In one context, you might use a linguistic technique and it have a very different effect. But nonetheless, that's what we're looking for. What are the choices that have been made in this text, and what are the likely effects as a result of that? So I guess that it is unconscious. But interestingly, I was once at a Corpus Linguistics conference, and I can't remember who it was who was talking about this, but they were talking about non-literary texts and advertising and that kind of thing. And whoever was giving the presentation said that, we often say, well, these choices are entirely unconscious. He says, not in this case. These are people who've done linguistics degrees. They've done critical discourse analysis. They know what they're doing. And so I guess, in some context like that, it might well be a conscious choice. If you're working in a particular kind of genre, and you're writing for a particular kind of effect, advertising, perhaps. But I guess in literature, 99% of the time, entirely unconscious, I would say.
I think talking about effects is really important, because something that I try and remind my students almost all the time is, typically you're just analyzing the output. You're analyzing the thing that readers will receive.
Yeah.
You're not analyzing directly the evidence of the effect. And often, students might say something, even not necessarily in a stylistics concept, but, looking at news language or any kind of text, really. And this, this particular adjective, makes the reader feel sad. And I'm constantly saying, how do you know? How do you know it? Did you ask? Who's the reader? And so I think what you said about the likely effect or the possible, or framing it as this appears to be a strategy to encourage the reader to feel this way, I think covers your back, in the sense that typically we're not looking at directly at the evidence of what is happening to the reader. Although it seems that is becoming more common with looking at reader response data and reviews and things that, especially in online communities that readers write. Is that kind of a fair way to frame how we talk about the effects of stylistic choices?
Yes, I think it is. I think unless you're doing experimental work, and it is very difficult to get to the real effects that textual choices have on readers. It's not impossible to hypothesize about them. I think you do need that experimental work to get the sort of conclusive answers. There is some of that work going on, of course, in cognitive linguistics and cognitive stylistics. But I guess that there is a difference in terms of, you talked about who is the reader, when you're doing a piece of stylistic analysis. And there is a difference in how you conceptualize the reader when you're doing corpus stylistics compared to cognitive stylistics. Cognitive stylistics, I think, is often about individual readers, individual interpretations, whereas the nature of corpus methods are such that we're talking about a sample from a population. So you're trying to generalize about that population. And in that respect, you're not necessarily talking about individual responses to texts either. But yeah, I think you're right. You have to be careful how you frame this. And I think a lot of the time, what stylistic analyses produce are hypotheses, hopefully testable. But yeah, you've got to be careful, I think. Yeah.
I want to ask you sort of a methodological question as well around the bits that happen before you actually get to doing the analysis, building or accessing the corpus in itself. Of course, it's a notoriously kind of big area of discussion in any application of corpus linguistics. And there've been a lot of, I've had conversation with a lot of guests where we've touched upon this. Most recently with Bethany Gray, with our entire conversation was all about representativeness in corpus design. But I want to ask you, I suppose, a slightly more practical question around, again, sticking with literary texts. Is it the case that you can just go and grab any ebook of any novel or poetry anthology and just take it and make a corpus and do your research with it? I'm asking kind of naively, but I'm assuming that probably are some restrictions around copyright and things like that. How does that work, and how does that influence, research in the field? Because certainly in other contexts, the stuff that's harder to get, people do it less, and researchers naturally and understandably gravitate towards the stuff that's convenient and cheaper and quicker to do. And so more broadly, there are far more written corpora than spoken corpora, for example, because spoken corpora are typically harder to build at scale, and so there's less of it around. Is there a similar effect with copyright and issues with literary corpora?
Yeah, I think it's a real problem. I think you can go and, as you say, create a corpus out of anything you want. The difficulty comes when you might want to share that. Yeah. And of course, I think that's really important, because that's how we can be replicable. You produce an analysis based on a corpus that you can't actually share with anybody, and that analysis can't easily be replicated or falsified. And so I think that's a problem, particularly with the moves towards open science that are increasingly common. So building corpora of contemporary literary texts, and particularly poems, I would say, I think that's really difficult, simply because permissions are so expensive, and I think publishers are so suspicious of what you're doing with these texts. I think that there are ways around it. For example, if you tag a text, tag a corpus, fill it full of part of speech tags, that's unreadable in that form.
Yes.
It's never going to be of use to anybody who just wants a cheap version of that particular text. So you might well be able to persuade publishers that that's a way around it. But I think it does, as you say, skew what people are looking at. So the big publicly available stylistics corpora out there, they're not contemporary texts, and those are sort of much more under the radar, really. I just built a corpus with some colleagues of 19th century fiction, 13 million words of contemporary, 19th century fiction by female authors. And when we started that project, we wanted to build a 20th century section to that corpus too. And it just proved impossible to do at that point. I think it's something that we should take seriously. And actually, I think now might be the moment to do it. because as we sort of move into an era of AI and large language models, I think what authors find is their work is being hoovered up by big software companies who have never asked any permission to do anything with that work. I think we as corpus linguists can at least go to authors and publishers and say, look, this is what we're going to do with this work. We can tell you how it will be protected. And so authors might hopefully then feel that they do retain some sense of control over their work. Mm. So it might be that now is a good time to try and revisit some of those copyright problems and permissions problems. But it is a problem, definitely.
Yeah, and I think, it potentially, if there is a sort of a skew towards, older sort of stylistic studies of older texts and harder to publish research on contemporary texts, and it may, inadvertently sort of contribute to a perception of it being a bit kind of traditional and old-fashioned, and so what are you going to do for me now? And it's a bit of a segue, but I'm going to go there anyway. You mentioned earlier about the sort of context in academia more broadly in the UK, and there've now been several examples in recent years, and rumblings of more to come, of lots of reasons for this, really, but closures of departments in linguistics and literature and languages and other disciplines in the humanities. And I think a lot of it is to do with the kind of funding models in the UK and the neoliberal kind of agenda of following the markets and students, consumers, and that sort of thing. I want to ask your thoughts about this in terms of what academics within these disciplines, including literary linguistics, corpus linguistics, stylists, we're all kind of in the same boat to an extent in terms of the social changes and political changes. What are your thoughts on this, and what do you think academics and researchers, early career researchers, students, can do, if anything, to try to defend the sort of work that we do?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question to answer because I think UK higher education at the moment, there are so many structural problems with it, as you say, that the kinds of things that you might have done a few years ago to try and keep your department secure and viable, they're not necessarily going to work anymore. So, if you'd asked me that question a few years ago, I would have said, well, one of the things that you should be doing is making sure that your department is as integrated into other areas of the university as it can possibly be, not just with other departments in your school or faculty, but with other faculties. The more joint courses you have, for example, the better, because if other faculties are reliant on your department for the delivery of their degrees, it just makes it so much harder for a university to sort of unplug you from that situation and close you down as a department. But I think increasingly, the departments that have been closed, the departments that are under threat, they're doing all this stuff anyway. They're achieving on all fronts. They have excellent research profiles, excellent teaching profiles. They're working hard at outreach. They're well integrated into their institutions, and still that doesn't keep them safe. You can't afford not to be achieving on all fronts now. So I don't think there's any situation I know about where a department is being closed down because it's failing in academic terms. They are, as you say, a lot of the time neoliberal decisions. So it is really difficult to know how you tackle that. I think there are at least, there are lots of reasons for why we're in this situation. One, as you say, is the problems with the funding model in UK higher education and the fact that fee income is no longer covering what it costs to teach a student. I do think there are other problems too. I think there's a big problem with management. I think there's an awful lot of bad management practice going on. I think there's a lot of vice chancellors who simply don't understand what's going on in their institutions. I can pretty much guarantee that any time a department is closed, at no point will that vice chancellor or deputy vice chancellor have come and sat down with the academics who are affected and said, look, this is the situation we're in. What can we do? So I don't think that senior managers are using the expertise in their institutions. I think in some cases, they're being willfully blind to what's going on. And in some cases, I think using the situation that we're in as an excuse to reshape the university along the lines of something that they're more interested in. And if we're being charitable, that might be with a view to securing the institution's longer term future. Less charitably, I think sometimes it's a case of wanting to make your mark and shape the institution around your own interests. So I think there are some really poor management practices going on, but you can't get away from the fact that that there are these underlying policy problems that need to be fixed about funding.
Yes,
but going back to your question, which was, what can we do about this? As I said, hard to know, but I do think one long-term thing that we could all be looking at is increasing the extent to which we do public engagement. Because I think the more that the public know what linguistics is and what it can do, the better. And I think, although there are lots of people doing lots of great work in that area, I think it is still the case that linguistics is a very misunderstood discipline, particularly by institutions. And that's something that I found in my previous place, that senior managers and the marketing department just did not understand what linguists did. And they didn't understand why you couldn't just lump linguistics in with English. And I think sometimes that was a willful misunderstanding, despite repeatedly trying to explain that, that message never really seemed to get through. And if you're in that situation, I think it's very easy to understand why a senior manager in financial trouble might look at a linguistics department and say, well, we've already got an English department. Why do we need somebody doing the same? And especially if they've been belligerent about trying to, fight their own cause and explain what they are and what they do. So I can sort of understand why linguistics might get singled out in that respect. So I think the more that we can do to get to a situation where students coming to university know what linguistics is, the better. And that doesn't necessarily have to be students who are going on to do linguistics themselves. You can be going on to university to do physics, but you know what a history degree is. And
yes,
I'm not suggesting that history is in any way more secure than we are. We do think it would help. And I think that means talking as much as you can to the public, trying to explain what linguistics is and what it does. I think it also means being careful about the things that we get involved in, because I do think that when linguists start getting involved in, word of the year competitions and that sort of thing, and getting involved in arguments about prescriptivism, I think that's letting the prescriptivists set the agenda. Often, as a result of that, you don't end up talking about the really, really interesting things that linguistics can do. Work in forensic linguistics, for example, or language teaching, speech therapy, whatever it might be. There's loads of stuff going on in linguistics people just don't know about. So it means telling people about linguistics. And I think it particularly means getting linguistics into schools. So it's not a surprise. It's not a new thing for students. And I know that, you and your colleagues at Aston do a lot of that kind of work. Anything we can do in that respect has got to be a plus, I think. And not just getting text analysis into schools, but getting some theoretical linguistics into schools and computation linguistics, that kind of thing. And I think the real value of linguistics to us when we're trying to solve this problem is the fact that it does straddle the humanities and the social sciences and even the hard sciences. So there is something for everybody, really. If you're not interested in stylistics, if that's a bit too humanities led for you, try something like phonetics or computational linguistics. So that's I think what we need to do. It's really get the message out there about what linguistics is. And I think that then makes it harder for universities to be willfully blind to linguistics departments. If students are very positive about what linguistics is, if they're talking the subject up, then universities they're not going to listen to us, but they'll listen to students. So that's the thing we need to do, I think.
I want to finish as we wrap up this conversation. I want to ask you about one of your own public engagement activities, I suppose. Babel Zine, of course.
Yeah.
Your languages and linguistics magazine. Tell us a bit about that. How long has it been running, and how, what is the sort of value of this sort of thing in terms of contributing to exactly the efforts that you were just discussing here?
Yeah, well, it's been running about 12 years now. And we set it up initially just as a project that was interesting to us. What we noticed was that you can go to a newsagent and you can buy a magazine about music or about art or about history. But there are no magazines about language. And we thought, well, there must be a gap in the market for that. If you look at, how many people are interested in language games and word games, and puzzles and that kind of thing, even how many people complain about language, there is an interest out there. So we thought, well, there must be a gap in the market for this. So that's why we set it up. And for us at the time, it was also useful as a sort of outreach project because my previous university's name was attached to it. We never made a big deal about that. But we did manage to use it to our own advantages when it came to things like recruiting students and that kind of thing. Since my former department was closed down, what we've managed to do is extract the magazine, and we've set it up as an independent company. So it's now a limited company in its own right. And I think there's a real advantage to that because it means when we don't any longer have any interest in using that to try and attract students to our institutions, it's now become something which we really wanted it to be when we first set it up, which was really a resource for the whole linguistics community, kind of like the linguistics equivalent of something like BBC History magazine. That's not a magazine that you associate with a particular university. And so I hope that, Babel might shift to being that kind of thing. And it's an outlet. It's a way of reaching an audience that is not an audience of linguistic specialists. We do have a lot of teachers reading the magazine, but quite often they're teachers of English literature. But we know that we also have people reading it who are simply interested in language generally. And so Babel offers an outlet if you want to talk about your research and get the public interested in it and get the public understanding what linguistics is. So that's what it's about. That's what it's for. I would encourage anybody who wants to write for it, please get in touch with us.
Well, I'm thrilled that Babel lives on, and hopefully for many more years to come as well. And yeah, I think these are exactly the sorts of things that help to keep what we do alive in the public conscience. So on behalf of linguistics, thank you for your contribution with the magazine. I normally ask a few quick questions. We don't have time for all three. I'm just going to ask you one, which is, what is your number one piece of advice for a student embarking, and I will specify corpus linguistics research. What's your number one piece of advice for someone who's new to this, who's about to start studying this?
Yeah, I would say understand what a corpus is, which sounds a very sort of naive thing to say, but I think if you understand that a corpus is a sample of language data that is intended to represent a population, that makes your life so much easier. And I think for students who come to corpus linguistics from a humanities background, perhaps from a stylistics background, that concept of samples and populations is sometimes a bit alien to them. I think once you've grasped what a corpus actually is in terms of being a sample of a population, then you're on much firmer ground with knowing what you can legitimately claim on the basis of your analysis. whether you can generalize about what you found in your analysis to a wider sample or not, as the case may be. So it might sound a really simple thing, but I think that samples and populations concept is really important.
Thank you. Wonderful advice and a great way to end the show. Thank you very much, Dan. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you. And that is it for today's episode of Corpus Cast. So thank you to our viewers and listeners for joining us, whether that's on YouTube or the audio streaming platform of your choice. In the meantime, do let us know your thoughts using the hashtag CorpusCast, and make sure to check out the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group on X at Aston Corpus, and you can follow me at Lovermob. Corpus Cast is an Aston Originals podcast hosted by me, Robbie Love, and produced by Sam Cook. Thanks again, and see you soon on the next episode of Corpus Cast. And thank you one more time to today's guest, Dan McIntyre. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thanks very much, Robbie.